Two American pilots crashed on the same remote island on the same night without ever seeing each other. One believed he was alone. The other thought he was already dead. But what neither man knew was that their accidents had revealed something the Japanese had been searching for months: a hidden American airfield that was never supposed to exist. The Pacific night was supposed to be quiet. A blanket of low clouds drifted over the ocean, smothering the moonlight and hiding everything beneath it. Out there, in the dark stretch between scattered islands, American reconnaissance pilots flew alone, pushing their fuel, their nerves, and their luck to the edge. Most nights passed without incident. But on this night, two pilots, flying two different missions, would meet the same fate without ever seeing each other. The first was Lieutenant Warren Hale, navigating by instinct more than instruments as a storm rolled in faster than expected. His compass flickered, his altimeter danced, and the radio hissed in and out like a dying flame. Hale had trained for emergencies, but nothing prepared him for the moment. His engine coughed once, then again, then fell silent altogether. His aircraft drifted downward into a void he could not understand, carrying him toward an island he had never seen on any map. The second pilot, Ensign Robert Carrick, was flying miles away, unaware that he was heading into the same trap. His mission had been simple: a routine patrol near a chain of uninhabited islands. Everything changed when a sudden flash of lightning illuminated something his instruments didn't show: a jagged ridge rising directly in front of him. He pulled up too late. The impact tore the aircraft apart and scattered the wreckage across the dense coastal brush. Carrick survived only because the twisted frame caught between two massive trees, preventing the cockpit from collapsing entirely. Two crashes, two survivors, two men who believed they had landed on meaningless, empty land. But they were wrong. Hidden deep inside that island was something the Japanese had failed to locate for months. An American airfield carved in secrecy, concealed with such precision that even U.S. pilots were not told of its existence. And now, without knowing it, both Hale and Carrick had exposed it, and the Japanese reconnaissance units listening to faint signals that night were already on the move. What began as two accidents would become a chain of events that threatened an entire Pacific operation. The island rose out of the Pacific like a shadow that refused to be named. Lieutenant Warren Hale did not see its outline until the last seconds before impact. Just a faint strip of dark sand and uneven brush cutting through the mist as his powerless aircraft glided lower and lower. There was no time to turn, no power to climb, no hope of clearing the rising terrain ahead. The wheels struck first, dragging across the sand with a violent shudder. Then the fuselage twisted sideways, skidding until the left wing dug deep and snapped with a hollow metallic crack that echoed through the tree-line. When Hale finally opened his eyes, the storm had softened into a distant roll of thunder. The cockpit canopy was cracked, the air smelled of hot metal, and the world outside looked strangely calm for a place that had nearly taken his life. He unfastened his harness, pushed the shattered frame aside, and stepped out onto the sand. His legs trembled beneath him, not from injury, but from the silent disbelief of still being alive. The beach stretched far in each direction, empty and untouched. No huts, no boats, no signal fires, nothing suggesting habitation. Only the steady rhythm of waves brushing against the wrecked landing gear and the scattered debris that had spilled from the belly of the aircraft. Hale moved slowly, scanning the tree-line for movement, listening for anything beyond the ocean's breath. He found a first clue that something was wrong, not in the forest, but in the sand. A small metal logbook casing, dented, scorched, and half buried near the edge of the crash trail. It didn't belong to his aircraft, and the markings on its surface were unlike anything standard for American issue. The metal was pitted as if it had been exposed to salt water for weeks, and faint characters scratched along one side suggested Japanese origin. Hale knelt, brushed the sand away, and lifted it carefully. It felt heavier than it looked, almost unnaturally so, and the hinge along its spine had been bent inward, as if crushed by force rather than corrosion. He turned it over twice, puzzled. It made no sound when shaken. Whatever had once been inside was either removed or ruined beyond recognition. But what unsettled him most was the simple fact that it should not have been here. No Japanese patrols were known in this region, and certainly none operating on an island this small and this far from reported activity. Hale tucked the casing into his flight jacket and continued up the beach toward the tree line. The forest was dense, humid, and strangely silent, too silent. No birds, no insects, no distant animal calls. Only the soft rustle of palm fronds bending under the last breath of the storm. He followed a narrow path of disturbed sand leading toward the interior, unsure whether it had been formed by wind, water, or footprints washed away by the tide. The further he walked, the more the island seemed wrong in ways he could not describe. A feeling of anticipation hung in the air, as if the place held a secret waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Shadows lingered where sunlight should have reached. Branches snapped underfoot with sharp, unnatural cracks. Hale paused every few steps, listening for echoes, aware he might not be as alone as the beach had first suggested. He had no idea that, miles away on the opposite side of the island, another survivor was struggling through similar confusion, and that both of them were walking toward the same concealed truth hidden at the island's heart. Ensign Robert Carrick regained consciousness to the sound of rain filtering through twisted metal. For a long moment, he did not know where he was. His vision wavered, blurring the outlines of shattered instruments and torn wiring that hung like vines around him. When he tried to move, a lance of pain traveled from his shoulder down to his ribs, forcing him to breathe slowly until the dizziness subsided. Only then did the memory of the impact return. The sudden ridge rising out of the darkness, the desperate pull on the stick, the violent spin that tore the aircraft apart as it plunged through the treetops. He unbuckled himself with difficulty, leaning forward as branches and fragments of canopy creaked under his weight. The cockpit had come to rest wedged between two enormous trees, suspended several feet above the forest floor. Below him, piles of leaves and broken branches glistened under the thin shafts of morning light that filtered through the canopy. Carrick lowered himself carefully, using the twisted metal frame as a ladder. When his boots finally touched the ground, he stood still for several seconds, focusing on the quiet rhythm of his breathing. The forest felt suffocatingly dense. Every surface was damp, from the moss-covered roots to the beads of moisture clinging to the underside of broad leaves. The air smelled of earth and something metallic, perhaps fuel, perhaps the cooling remnants of the engine. Carrick searched the ground for anything that had fallen from the wreck during impact. A few pieces of equipment lay scattered nearby, a shattered altimeter, a torn flight map, and his emergency kit, which had miraculously remained intact. He picked up the map first. Much of it was shredded, but a few fragments showed waterways and island outlines familiar to his patrol route. Yet the shape of the land where he now stood did not match anything he could piece together. The island beneath him was absent from the patrol charts, the reconnaissance grids, even the classified overviews used by senior navigators. That thought tightened the discomfort in his chest. Pilots relied on maps not only for direction, but for reassurance, the simple belief that they understood the world beneath them. Here, that comfort evaporated. As he folded the map scraps, his boot brushed against something partially buried under the leaves. He knelt and brushed the debris aside. What surfaced was unsettling, a fragment of an aircraft panel, but not from his own. The metal bore faded Japanese characters, corroded along the edges, and a jagged tear down the middle. This was not the wreckage of a recent crash. The corrosion suggested months, perhaps longer, of exposure. Carrick lifted it carefully, turning it toward a sliver of light. The edges glimmered faintly with salt crust, as if it had once been submerged in water before ending up deep in the forest. The discovery raised more questions than answers. No Japanese air operations had been reported near this sector for months. The idea that another aircraft, enemy or otherwise, had come down on this same island felt improbable. Yet here it was, as real as the damp earth beneath his fingers. He set the panel fragment aside, feeling an uneasy connection to an unseen presence. Someone else had been here, long before him, and whatever had happened had left traces scattered across the interior of the island. Carrick gathered his supplies and began walking toward a faint slope that seemed to rise toward the island center. The forest floor shifted from soft soil to firmer ground, and faint depressions appeared at irregular intervals. Not quite footprints, but disturbances that hinted at past movement. He followed them slowly, pausing to listen each time the wind carried distant rustles through the canopy. The island felt alive in ways he could not explain. Not hostile, but observant, as though we're waiting. Every step carried him deeper into a place that should not have existed, towards something he sensed rather than understood. And somewhere beyond the dense wall of vegetation, another man was moving through the shadows, equally unaware that their fates were now entwined by two crashes that were never meant to happen. Lieutenant Hale reached the forest's interior as the daylight strengthened, revealing more of the island's unsettling stillness. Each step sank slightly into soft soil that held impressions of time, not of people, as if the island remembered movement but refused to show it clearly. The deeper he walked, the more he sensed a strange order within the chaos of trees and vines, as though paths once existed but had long since surrendered to the slow, reclaiming hand of nature. The logbook casing inside his jacket felt heavier now, pulsing faintly with the weight of unspoken history. He stopped when a faint sound, almost like tapping, drifted through the thick air. It wasn't wind, nor the settling of branches. It came in irregular intervals, metallic, distant, and deliberate. Hale held his breath to isolate the direction. The tapping repeated, sharper this time, echoing lightly through the undergrowth. It reminded him of the clanking noise made when a loose metal panel struck against a pole during strong wind, except that here the air was still. He moved toward the sound, taking care with each step so the branches underfoot did not betray his presence. The terrain shifted subtly as he climbed a small ridge. The foliage thinned near the top, and through the gaps he could see a wide clearing below, almost circular, with flattened grass and disturbed earth. It looked unnatural, not the work of animals or storms. Hale lowered himself behind a fallen trunk and observed the clearing with cautious patience. At first he saw nothing but debris, splintered wood, rusted metal shards, and what resembled the corner of a buried crate. Then he noticed the central object, a short wooden pole, reinforced at the base with metal bands, stood halfway buried in the soil. Attached to it was a small sheet of rusted steel, dangling loosely from a hinge. Every passing breeze made it shift just enough to strike the pole, producing the tapping sound Hale had followed. The object fell out of place, too deliberate to be random debris, too damaged to hold any clear function. He approached slowly, crouching as he examined the remnants. The metal plate had markings along its edge, faint but still visible, geometric lines, possibly directional, though worn nearly to nothing. He lifted the plate gently. Beneath the rust, he saw something that chilled him more than any storm ever had. Embedded in the fibers of the wood, near the hinge, were fragments of paint the exact shade used in American field equipment, a matte gray-green that had been standardized only months prior. The pole, the hinge, the plate, they were American, and their presence on an unmapped island was something that should not have been possible. Hale's pulse quickened. He scanned the clearing again, this time noticing subtle geometry beneath the soil, faint outlines of rectangular shapes, as if foundations or storage pits had once been here. He brushed the dirt with his boot and uncovered a corner of what appeared to be a concrete slab. Concrete meant construction. Construction meant planning. Planning meant a purpose. And that purpose had been hidden. He stood still for several seconds, letting the implication settle. If this island contained an American structure, even a partial one, it had been built in secrecy. Not even reconnaissance pilots like Hale, who flew routes spanning hundreds of miles, had been briefed on anything of the kind, which meant this installation was not only secret, it was classified above his level, perhaps even above the squadron commanders. As Hale stepped away from the slab, a faint tremor ran beneath the earth, so subtle he wondered if it had been his imagination. A low hum followed, distant yet steady, like the resonance of machinery buried deep underground. He turned toward the sound instinctively, but the forest shrouded everything beyond a veil of leaves and shifting shadows. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the hum stopped. Silence reclaimed the clearing. Hale tightened his grip on the logbook casing. Whatever facility had once stood here, it was not entirely dead. And somewhere on this island, another man was drawing closer to the same truth, guided by crashes that were beginning to feel far less accidental than he first believed. Ensign Robert Carrick continued his ascent toward the island's interior, guided only by the gradual rise of the terrain and by a growing sense that he was not moving through untouched wilderness, but rather through a place shaped by human intention. The forest felt denser here, its branches crossing overhead like the ribs of some ancient structure. Moisture clung to every surface, turning the air into a warm, heavy mist that blurred the edges of distance and softened the sound around him until even his own footsteps seemed quieter than they should have been. As he climbed, he noticed irregular signs that unsettled him more than the remnants of his crash. Several branches bore clean diagonal cuts, as if made by a tool rather than broken by weather. Fallen trunks showed shallow notches, too uniform to be accidental, and scattered along the ground were pieces of wood shaped into narrow wedges, brittle with age yet unmistakably manufactured. None of it suggested a permanent settlement, but all of it pointed to activity, deliberate, purposeful, and long hidden. He paused when a faint metallic glint caught his eye through a cluster of ferns. Moving aside the leaves, he uncovered a small rectangular plate of metal, partially embedded in the soil. Its surface bore faint scoring marks, the kind made by repeated friction or pressure, and one corner was bent inward as though crushed by something heavy. Carrick lifted it to the light filtering through the canopy and turned it slowly in his hands. The paint beneath the corrosion was muted, leaning toward a gray-green shade he recognized from American aircraft components. But the configuration of the edges and the subtle ridge lines did not match any panel he had ever seen on his own squadron's machines. The deeper he studied the plate, the more certain he became that it did not belong here. Whatever aircraft it had once been part of, it had not fallen recently. The corrosion suggested months of exposure, and the irregular bending indicated force rather than natural decay. He slipped it into his pack and resumed walking, unsettled by how these discoveries layered onto one another without forming a complete picture. The forest eventually narrowed into a natural corridor where tall palms stood in a staggered alignment, casting long streaks of filtered light across the ground. Carrick followed the corridor as it curved gently toward the west, and as he walked, he noticed the earth beneath his boots becoming firmer, more compacted, almost as if the soil had once been tamped down by repeated movement. It was not a trail, at least not in the traditional sense, but it was something that had been shaped by purpose. He reached a point where the trees parted just enough to reveal the outline of a shallow basin below him. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a depression filled with tangled vines and ferns. But as he squinted through the shifting patterns of sunlight, he noticed straight lines, faint but present, beneath the vegetation. They ran parallel, evenly spaced, and extended further across the basin than the eye could easily measure. Carrick descended slowly, brushing aside the vines as he reached the basin floor. The ground felt unnaturally level beneath the dense growth, and the soil had a hardness that did not match the surrounding forest. He knelt, dug his fingers into the dirt, and uncovered a thin layer of compacted gravel. Beneath that, he found something more telling: a slab of concrete, cracked along one edge but unmistakably artificial. A chill ran through him. Concrete meant construction. Construction meant planning. Planning meant purpose. And the purpose for a concrete platform in a remote, unmapped island could only be strategic. As he stood again, he realized that somewhere beyond the ridge to his east, unseen but not distant, Lieutenant Warren Hale was experiencing his own version of this discovery. Two men, two crashes, two trails of clues, all converging toward the same hidden truth that neither of them had been meant to find. Lieutenant Warren Hale approached the far edge of the clearing he had discovered earlier, carrying the dented logbook casing in one hand while scanning the terrain for any sign of additional structures. Something about the ground felt wrong each time he stepped onto the compacted soil. It was firm in a way that did not belong to natural earth, almost as if the island was wearing a mask designed to deceive anyone who happened to pass overhead. With each footfall, he sensed he was walking across something concealed rather than abandoned. As he moved deeper into the clearing, the forest canopy shifted unexpectedly, revealing a long, straight corridor of filtered sunlight cutting between the trees. The alignment struck him as too precise to be coincidence. He walked toward it, brushing aside low branches until the ground beneath him took on a subtly smoother texture. The soil gave way to gravel, and beneath that, patches of cracked concrete emerged in uneven sections where roots had begun to pry their way upward. It was then that he understood what he was standing on. Not a foundation, not a storage pit, but a runway, or what had once been one. The realization felt almost unreal. An airstrip carved into the interior of an island that did not appear on any maps. A place where aircraft could land unseen by reconnaissance patrols. The surrounding vegetation had grown over it with meticulous completeness, guided either by time or by deliberate camouflage. Hale knelt and traced the faint center line that still lingered beneath a film of dirt and moss. The markings were faint but unmistakable. This place had been built with precision. A soft rustle behind him interrupted his thoughts. He turned sharply, expecting the sound of an animal, only to see a figure emerging cautiously from the opposite edge of the clearing. The man moved through the shadows with uneven steps, one hand bracing his side as though nursing an injury. His flight jacket was torn, his face marked by cuts and dried blood, but his posture carried the unmistakable discipline of naval training. Hale tensed, unsure whether to call out, but as the figure stepped into the light, recognition broke through the uncertainty. "Ensign Carrick," Hale murmured under his breath, though the other man was still too far to hear it. Carrick paused as well, noticing Hale for the first time. A long moment passed in silence as both men tried to reconcile the improbability of finding another American pilot on a nameless island in the middle of the Pacific. Then, slowly, Carrick descended the small embankment and approached, each step careful and deliberate. The two men met at the center of the overgrown runway, the forest quiet around them as though holding its breath. "I didn't think anyone else survived out here," Carrick said, his voice low, strained from the crash, "or that this island was supposed to exist." Hale held up the battered logbook casing. "You're not the only one finding things that shouldn't be here." Carrick nodded, then unfastened his pack and removed the corroded metal panel he had found earlier. "Whatever this place was," he said, "it wasn't abandoned without reason." Together they surveyed the length of the hidden runway, noting the subtle depressions where support structures had once stood, the faint remnants of tie-down points, and the nearly invisible grooves where aircraft wheels had rolled years before. It was not a relic of the enemy. This place bore American engineering, yet it had been concealed so thoroughly that even pilots flying patrol routes over the region remained unaware. Hale's gaze drifted toward the dense forest at the far end of the runway. "Someone built this to stay hidden," he said, "but someone else wanted it forgotten." Carrick followed his line of sight, sensing the same unease. "The question is why?" Before either man could continue, a distant rumble echoed from the direction of the shoreline, a low, resonant boom that felt like thunder but did not carry the rhythm of storm. The sound drew their attention instantly, cracking the fragile calm that had settled between them. Whatever secret the island held, it was no longer dormant. And somewhere beyond the trees, a chain of consequences born from two crashes was gathering momentum. The two pilots remained at the center of the overgrown runway for several minutes, as if the silence around them were gathering the fragments of a story they had uncovered only by accident. The forest breathed faintly in the background, carrying with it the scent of salt and the distant echo of the rumble they had heard from the shore. Nothing moved beyond the tree line, yet both men sensed the island was no longer content to hide its past. It felt as though the place had been waiting for witnesses, not enemies, not planners, but ordinary airmen who would see it without the veil of secrecy that had kept it invisible for so long. Hale studied the cracked concrete beneath his boots, imagining the crews who had once walked across it, the hurried gestures of ground personnel, the quiet signals exchanged before operations that would never be written into any official account. Carrick held the corroded panel he had found earlier, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. It fit into the narrative they were beginning to understand. A forgotten facility, built for a purpose buried so deeply behind layers of classification that even the men who served nearby were unaware of its existence. The distant rumble came again, softer this time, almost like an echo fading across the water, and both men knew it marked a change neither could clearly define. Perhaps it was the weather shifting offshore, perhaps the faint remnants of naval operations far beyond the horizon. In the quiet that followed, the runway felt less like a relic and more like a reminder. Every war contains places that shape events in silence, places never drawn on maps, places that continue to hold their stories long after the documents are sealed and the briefings end. As Hale and Carrick prepared to move toward the shoreline together, they carried with them the strange artifacts they had found, the dented logbook casing, the crushed metal plate, pieces of a history concealed on purpose, revealed only by chance. Their crashes had been unintended, but their discovery was not accidental. In the vastness of the Pacific, this hidden island remained a quiet testament to a moment when secrecy and survival briefly converged, leaving behind a trace barely visible in the shifting sands of the war. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.